When Japanese soldiers surrendered in World War II, they braced for death. What they got instead was a plate of food and a lesson in mercy that shattered their beliefs. They thought death would be their only honor. That was the code. For years, Japanese soldiers were told surrender meant shame, worse than dying on the battlefield. So when the last shells fell on Saipan in the summer of 1944, the surviving soldiers looked around in disbelief. The smell of smoke and blood still hung thick in the air. Entire platoons had vanished in suicidal charges. But a few hundred men, tired, hungry, hollow-eyed, stood with trembling hands as American troops surrounded them. For many, it was the first time they had seen an American up close. The enemy was supposed to be barbaric, a monster wearing a human face. That's what Tokyo's radio had preached again and again. Yet, as U.S. Marines approached, rifles steady but not mocking, something didn't fit the picture. There were no jeers, no cruelty, just calm orders in a language the prisoners barely understood. Private Shigeru Nakahara was one of them. He had been 19 when he left Okinawa, full of duty and pride. By the time Saipan fell, he was gaunt and barefoot, clutching a broken rifle that no longer fired. When a Marine motioned for him to drop it, he hesitated, then let it fall. That sound, metal hitting dirt, marked the end of everything he had believed about honor. The Americans offered water, bread, cigarettes. Some prisoners refused, convinced it was a trick. Others reached out with shaking hands, unable to resist. Nakahara drank, the first clean water in days. It burned down his throat like fire, and tears came without warning. Nearby, an interpreter shouted in Japanese, "You will not be harmed if you cooperate." The prisoners exchanged uneasy glances. It didn't make sense. Why were they alive? Why weren't they being executed on the spot? They had heard stories, propaganda, that Americans mutilated prisoners. Instead, the Marines were calling for medics to check their wounds. Over the next days, as American victory solidified across the Pacific, more captives were taken. From Guam to Tinian, a small but steady trickle of Japanese POWs began to gather under U.S. supervision. Most were soldiers too weak to keep fighting. Some civilians swept into the chaos. Each carried the same haunted look, half-starved, half-ashamed. At temporary holding areas near the beaches, the prisoners sat in silence. They watched American soldiers eat rations openly, sharing the occasional canteen or extra pack of biscuits. The contrast was unbearable. Their own rations back home had dwindled to a handful of rice and roots. For some, the Americans' behavior shattered years of indoctrination overnight. For others, it deepened confusion. Could an enemy so powerful still show mercy? In Guam, a lieutenant named Kenji Takahashi tried to keep order among his men. He gathered them in a line, whispering, "Remember, they will photograph us. Stand straight. Do not speak. We are soldiers of the Emperor." But when an American guard smiled faintly at him and handed him a cigarette, the lieutenant didn't know how to respond. He hadn't seen a smile from anyone in months. He accepted it reluctantly, the small ember of tobacco glowing between his fingers like an absurd act of peace. Some prisoners were still defiant. A few attempted suicide or escape. Others refused food, expecting punishment. Yet the Americans followed the Geneva Convention, something most Japanese soldiers had never even heard of. They were given clean water, medical treatment, and rest. Word began to spread among the captives. They were being shipped to America itself. At first, no one believed it. "They'll kill us on the way," someone muttered. "They'll put us in cages." But the rumors persisted. Ships were being prepared in the harbors, and lists of names were being read out by interpreters. The men lined up, silent, watching the horizon. For many, the ocean voyage would be their first time leaving Asia. The fear of the unknown loomed larger than ever. Yet something else began to stir. A faint curiosity. What was America really like? Could the land of their enemies truly be as monstrous as the propaganda claimed? Or had they been living inside a lie? Nakahara wrote in his diary, using scraps of paper he had hidden in his uniform. "I am still alive. I don't understand why. The Americans treat us as men, not beasts. I feel both shame and gratitude. I wish I could forget the Emperor's voice in my head." That night, as the guards counted them once more before lights out. The camp was quiet, except for the distant rumble of trucks. The prisoners lay awake, their stomachs aching, their pride torn in half. They didn't know it yet, but the worst was over, and the strangest part of their journey was just beginning. But across the Pacific, ships were waiting, and soon they would carry these men into a world they could never have imagined. The morning the prisoners were herded toward the docks, the air was thick with sea salt and dread. A line of Japanese soldiers, thin as shadows, shuffled down the ramp toward a transport ship flying the American flag. U.S. Marines watched quietly, weapons slung but hands relaxed. The ship, gray, weathered, built for war, now carried something entirely different: the defeated. For many of the prisoners, this was the first time they had stood so close to an American vessel. The sight of it, the polished metal, the organized precision of the crew, felt like looking into another world. To them, America wasn't a place, it was a myth, a land of arrogance and power. Yet as they stepped aboard, they didn't find cruelty. They found order, structure, and rules. Private Nakahara was pushed forward, his hands still bound loosely. The deck under his feet vibrated with the steady rhythm of the ship's engines. The sound felt alien, mechanical, unstoppable. As the ship began to move, a murmur rippled among the prisoners. Some whispered prayers to ancestors, others turned their faces to the sea, hoping the wind would carry a last thought home to Japan. The first day aboard was silent. The men were herded into the lower decks, separated from the crew by steel partitions and guards standing watch. Buckets served as toilets. Mattresses were stacked along the walls, and the smell of fuel clung to the air. They were fed twice a day, small portions of rice and a strange brown stew. The Americans called it beef hash. The Japanese soldiers eyed it warily, unsure if it was edible. One Marine, a young guard from Iowa named Corporal Stevens, watched them with cautious curiosity. He'd been fighting in the Pacific for over a year and had seen enough death to last a lifetime. Now he stood guard over men who, a month earlier, might have killed him. "They don't look like monsters," he muttered to his partner. "Just tired men." On the second day, a storm hit. The ship tossed violently, and the men below deck began to vomit. The guards handed out saltine crackers and paper towels, speaking in slow, clear English they knew wouldn't be understood. Still, the gesture mattered. For the first time, some prisoners looked their captors in the eye, not with hatred, but confusion. By the fourth day, something began to shift. The Americans allowed small groups to come on deck for air. The Pacific stretched endlessly around them. Blue, calm, deceptive. Nakahara stood at the railing, his hands resting on the cold metal, and watched the horizon fade into nothing. He thought of home, of his mother's kitchen, of the sound of cicadas on summer nights. He tried to imagine Japan from the other side of the ocean, and the thought made his throat tighten. Nearby, Lieutenant Takahashi watched too. "Strange," he murmured to another prisoner. "They let us breathe, eat, even stand in the sun. They don't even curse us." The other man, too weak to respond, just stared at the sky. The Americans weren't sentimental. They followed protocol. The prisoners were counted, inspected, and checked by Navy doctors. Some had tropical ulcers or malaria. The medics treated them without a word of contempt. They cleaned wounds, handed out aspirin, even shared cigarettes when off duty. None of it made sense to the Japanese soldiers, who had been taught that surrender was dishonor, that mercy was weakness. Yet here they were, being tended to by their conquerors. As the voyage continued, rumors spread below deck. Some believed they were being taken to a prison island. Others said they'd be executed after interrogation. One man swore he heard that Americans used prisoners for experiments. But the truth was quieter, less dramatic. They were being sent to a network of POW camps scattered across the United States, where they would work, wait, and survive the war. A week into the journey, Nakahara heard laughter from above deck. American sailors were swapping stories, voices echoing through the metal walls. For the first time in months, he heard something that didn't sound like command or chaos. It sounded like life. He closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him, not knowing why it made him feel both comforted and small. As the coastline of California came into view, a strange murmur spread among the prisoners. The land was unlike anything they had imagined. Green hills, small towns, rows of buildings that looked untouched by war. No smoke, no rubble. America seemed almost unreal, like a dream painted in color after years of gray. When the ship finally docked, they were ordered to disembark. Trucks waited on the pier, engines idling. Armed guards lined the route, but none raised their voices. The prisoners stepped off the ship, squinting under the sunlight. One of them whispered, "This place, it smells like wheat." The drive inland was long. They passed farmlands, cattle fields, and small towns where children watched from porches. Some waved. The prisoners didn't know how to respond. It was the first time many of them had seen civilians who weren't afraid of them. By the time they reached the Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, the sun was low and the air was cold. Barbed wire surrounded neat rows of wooden barracks. The American flag fluttered above the gate. A sign read, U.S. Army Prisoner of War Camp 1002. They were searched, tagged, and assigned numbers. Nakahara's tag read, POW 219. He clutched it, feeling both identified and erased. That night, lying on a cot under a rough wool blanket, he could still feel the rocking of the ship beneath him. For the first time since his capture, he realized he hadn't been beaten, starved, or humiliated. He was alive, and no one had demanded anything in return. But survival had only bought him a new kind of uncertainty, because the next morning, the Americans would show these men something that neither war nor propaganda had prepared them for. The gates of Camp McCoy closed behind them with a heavy clang, sealing away the world they once knew. Rows of barbed wire stretched in every direction, surrounding wooden barracks that stood in neat military order. Watchtowers loomed above the fences, manned by American guards in wool coats, rifles slung over their shoulders. The air was sharp and cold. For the men from the Pacific, where humidity wrapped the islands like a second skin, Wisconsin's autumn felt almost cruel. Inside the gates, Japanese prisoners shuffled forward under the orders of English-speaking sergeants and interpreters. They were lined up, searched again, and given new clothes. Ill-fitting khaki uniforms marked PW. The process was efficient, methodical, and impersonal. They were no longer soldiers of the Emperor. They were now prisoners of the United States Army. Private Shigeru Nakahara watched as his old uniform, the tattered remains of his identity, was tossed into a pile. He wanted to protest, to hold on to something that connected him to home, but his voice caught in his throat. When an American guard handed him a blanket, folded neatly, he hesitated before taking it. "Thank you," he whispered in broken English. The guard didn't answer, just gave a short nod and moved on to the next man. Nearby, Lieutenant Takahashi was trying to maintain composure. He kept his chin high as a medical officer examined his eyes and mouth. When the doctor asked through an interpreter if he had any injuries, Takahashi responded stiffly, "A soldier does not complain." The interpreter relayed it, and the doctor gave a faint, tired smile. "You're not a soldier right now," he said quietly. "You're a man who needs rest." Takahashi didn't respond, but the words stayed with him. Once processed, the men were led to their new barracks, long wooden buildings lined with bunk beds, each equipped with a thin mattress and a wool blanket. Compared to the caves and tunnels many had lived in during combat, it was almost luxurious. Yet the shame was heavier than the cold. The silence between them wasn't just about fear, it was about identity. They had been raised to die for Japan, not to sleep under the enemy's roof. Later that evening, the sound of a bell echoed across the camp. Guards shouted something about food. The prisoners followed the smell. An unfamiliar warmth carried through the air, rich and heavy. It wasn't rice. It wasn't fish. It was something else. Some thought it might be a trap or a test. Still, hunger won over suspicion. They entered the mess hall, where long tables were arranged in rows. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting pale reflections on metal trays stacked at the entrance. Behind a counter stood American cooks, ladling portions of steaming food: beef stew, potatoes, white bread, butter, coffee, and small bowls of fruit cocktail. Nakahara froze at the sight. Real meat. Real fruit. For months he had eaten roots, insects, and scraps of rice soaked in muddy water. His stomach twisted, unsure if it could handle what his eyes were seeing. When his turn came, he held out the tray with shaking hands. The cook, a broad-shouldered man from Kansas, scooped a generous portion of stew and said, "Eat up." The Japanese prisoners took their seats cautiously. No one spoke. The first bite came hesitantly, then another. The flavor, simple, salty, familiar in a foreign way, hit like a wave. One man began to cry quietly. Another muttered, "They are feeding us like men." Someone whispered a prayer. Lieutenant Takahashi stared at his tray. The stew was thick with carrots and chunks of beef. He had never eaten American food before. The smell reminded him faintly of home cooking, though heavier, richer. He took a bite, and something inside him broke. Not from disgust, but from confusion. His entire life, he'd been told the Americans were savages. Yet here he was, tasting mercy in every spoonful. A few seats away, Nakahara wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes burning. The stew filled not just his stomach, but a space inside him he hadn't realized was empty. The other prisoners ate in silence, some with tears running freely down their faces. The guards stood by the door, watching quietly. No one mocked them, no one shouted. After the meal, an interpreter addressed the room. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will not be harmed if you follow the rules. You will work, you will eat, and you will live." The men sat motionless, absorbing the words. "You will live." It sounded unreal. That night, the barracks were still. The only sound was the rustle of blankets and the faint hum of the wind outside. For the first time in months, there were no air raid sirens, no gunfire, no explosions, just breathing. Takahashi lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams. "Why?" he whispered into the dark. "Why would they feed us?" From the bunk above, a quiet voice answered. It was Nakahara. "Maybe they don't hate us as much as we thought." The lieutenant didn't reply. He just turned his face to the wall, eyes open until morning. But as dawn broke over the Wisconsin hills, the reality of captivity began to settle in, and with it came questions that would test everything they had ever believed. The next morning came with a mist that hung low over the camp. The guards moved along the barracks, calling for roll. Names and numbers echoed through the chilly air. The men answered one by one, voices soft but steady. It was the first full day in captivity, and already the strangeness of American order was settling in. After roll call, work assignments were handed out. Some were sent to clean barracks or sweep pathways, others unloaded supplies from trucks. Every task came with rules, and every rule came with fairness. The guards enforced discipline, but without cruelty. The Japanese prisoners watched carefully, waiting for the moment the kindness would fade into mockery or punishment. But it didn't. By midday, the camp bell rang again. The same smell drifted across the yard, warm, rich, and unfamiliar. The men looked at one another. Yesterday's meal hadn't been a fluke. They were being fed well again. Inside the mess hall, trays clattered and voices murmured. Today's menu: mashed potatoes, meatloaf, green beans, and a slice of white bread with butter. For dessert, something they didn't have a word for: apple pie. The prisoners lined up, silent as before. An American cook behind the counter gave a half smile and said, "Good morning, fellas." Of course, no one answered. Few understood English, but tone was universal. The friendliness unsettled them more than any insult could have. When Nakahara reached the counter, he met the eyes of the cook. For a brief second, both men hesitated. The cook saw a face that looked far too young for war. Thin cheeks, hollow eyes. Without a word, he placed an extra spoonful of mashed potatoes on the tray and whispered, "Eat. You'll need it." At the table, the men sat stiffly, unsure of how to behave. The first bite brought silence again. It wasn't Japanese food, no rice, no miso, no soy, but it was hot, filling, and tasted of something they hadn't felt in months: care. Lieutenant Takahashi took a forkful of meatloaf and chewed slowly. He'd expected to hate it, maybe even spit it out. But instead, the flavor made him pause. "This is sweet," he murmured. Across the table, Nakahara nodded, unable to speak, A young soldier at the end of the table suddenly pushed his tray away. "We don't deserve this," he muttered in Japanese. "The Americans mock us." Takahashi looked at him. "They could starve us if they wanted to," he said quietly. "Yet they feed us. Maybe they're not the ones mocking." No one answered, but the conversation hung in the air like smoke. Outside the hall, the guards waited patiently. Some leaned on their rifles, others smoked, watching through the windows. They didn't interfere, but their presence was constant, firm, not hostile. When the meal ended, a few prisoners stood and bowed slightly before leaving. It wasn't expected. No one had told them to. It just felt right. Respect was something they still understood, even in defeat. Later that day, the men were allowed to write short letters through the International Red Cross. They were given paper, pencils, and clear instructions. No military information, only personal messages. The interpreter translated their words, line by line. Nakahara wrote to his mother, "I am alive. I am in America. They treat us fairly. Please do not worry." When he handed the paper to the guard, the man read the English portion and nodded. "Good," he said softly. "You'll get it back to her soon." That night, the barracks were warmer. A few men whispered quietly before sleep. The fear that had once sat in their chests was beginning to shift into something more complex, something like confusion wrapped in gratitude. Takahashi lay awake again, staring at the ceiling beams. "We were taught mercy was weakness," he said softly. "But maybe it's something else." From the next bunk, Nakahara's voice came through the dark. "Do you think they hate us?" The lieutenant thought for a moment. "They fight us," he said, "but I don't think they hate us. Not like we were told." Outside, a truck engine started, fading into the distance. Beyond the fences, life continued. Farmers worked, children went to school, families ate dinner by warm stoves. Inside the wire, men once sworn to die for their emperor were learning that the enemy's kindness could be as disorienting as his firepower. Days turned into a rhythm: work, meals, rest. The food never changed much, but it became something sacred. The first American meal was no longer just a story. It was a moment that redefined survival. Some men secretly collected their tin cups and trays as mementos. A few even traded canteen coffee packets for extra bread, laughing quietly in a language the guards didn't understand. One afternoon, weeks later, an American officer visited the camp and asked through the interpreter if the food was acceptable. Takahashi stood and replied formally, "Yes, sir." "Better than we deserve." The officer nodded once, then said, "You're not prisoners of hate, not prisoners of war." That night, as Nakahara wrote another letter, he added a new line at the bottom. "The Americans feed us as they feed their own. I don't understand it, but I'm thankful." He paused, then set down the pencil and closed his eyes. He could still taste the stew from that first night, the warmth, the salt, the strange sweetness of peace hidden inside a spoonful of food. But kindness, once tasted, has a way of changing everything. And soon, daily life in the camp would start to reshape their very sense of identity. By the third week, the routine of Camp McCoy had taken hold. The prisoners rose before sunrise, lined up for inspection, worked through the day, and ended each evening with the same call for lights out. The strict rhythm of military life hadn't vanished. It had simply changed uniforms. But what caught them most off guard was how ordinary life inside an American POW camp began to feel. The work varied. Some men cleaned the camp, others repaired fences or chopped wood for the kitchen. The younger ones were sometimes sent out under guard to nearby farms, where they helped harvest beets and potatoes. For that, they received camp tokens, small cardboard coins they could exchange at the canteen for soap, stationery, or the occasional chocolate bar. It was strange to be treated as laborers, not enemies. Even stranger was being paid. Lieutenant Takahashi couldn't shake the irony. In the Imperial Army, he had worked and fought without rest, without pay, without question. Here, under enemy control, he was earning money for picking vegetables. He didn't know whether to laugh or feel ashamed. One afternoon, while loading crates onto a truck, Nakahara overheard two American guards chatting nearby. They were young, barely older than him. One was talking about his wife back in Illinois, how she sent letters that smelled faintly of perfume. The other joked about missing his mother's apple pie. Their laughter was easy, unguarded. Nakahara watched them quietly. For the first time, he wondered if these men, his captors, had mothers who prayed for them the same way his did. At lunch, the guards handed out sandwiches. White bread, ham, mustard. Nakahara took his and sat on a stump. The guard who'd handed it to him, a man with sunburned cheeks, gave a simple nod. No words, just that small gesture. It was enough. Back in the camp, conversations between prisoners began to shift. The talk was no longer about dying for Japan, but about surviving in America. Some discussed the odd kindness of the guards. Others debated whether it was genuine or strategic. A few still refused to eat, clinging to the old code of loyalty. But hunger was persuasive. One by one, even the most stubborn men began lining up for the mess hall. In the evenings, after work, the prisoners sometimes heard music playing faintly from the guardhouse, swing tunes, violins, and the deep rhythmic pulse of American jazz. It was unlike anything they'd known. Lieutenant Takahashi would sit on his bunk, listening through the thin wooden walls. He didn't understand the language of the songs, but he understood the feeling. Freedom had a sound, and it echoed just beyond the barbed wire. Letters began to arrive. The Red Cross had delivered the first batch of mail from Japan. Some men wept openly as they read the words of wives and mothers who had believed them dead. Others couldn't bear to read at all. The paper trembled in their hands. The war was still raging across the Pacific, and they knew their families were struggling to survive the bombings, the rationing, the propaganda. Nakahara received a letter from his older brother, a teacher in Osaka. It was brief. "We are alive. Father's health is weak. Do not shame us by forgetting who you are." The words stung. That single line, "Do not shame us," echoed for days. He didn't know how to respond. Shame had already wrapped itself around him like a second skin. But when he thought of the warm meals, the fair treatment, the strange kindness of strangers, a quiet question began to form in his heart. If compassion was shameful, what did honor truly mean? One evening, Takahashi gathered a few men outside the barracks to speak. He had once been their commanding officer, and old habits of leadership remained. "We are not here to die," he said softly. "We are here to remember. Watch these people. Learn from them. They have power, but they do not abuse it. There is something to understand in that." The men listened silently. In another life, such words would have been treason. Now, they sounded like truth. The following week, an American chaplain visited the camp. He wasn't there to convert anyone. His job was to check welfare and ensure compliance with the Geneva Convention. But he spoke with a gentleness that disarmed even the most stoic prisoners. Through the interpreter, he said, "No man chooses his war, but every man chooses what kind of human he remains in it." Those words lingered long after he left. As the seasons shifted, snow began to dust the camp's roofs. The Japanese soldiers had never seen snow like this. Soft, quiet, endless. The guards issued them winter coats. Some of the men laughed at the size of the American boots they were given, far too big, flopping as they walked. For the first time, laughter filled the camp without fear. On Christmas Eve, the guards played music over the loudspeakers. Silent Night drifted through the air, its melody strange yet soothing. The prisoners didn't understand the lyrics, but the tone was unmistakable, a kind of peace that reached beyond language. That night, the mess hall served something extraordinary: turkey, mashed potatoes, and slices of canned peaches. No one spoke during the meal, but more than a few whispered silent prayers. Takahashi looked across the table at his men, their faces calm, their hands steady. "Strange," he said quietly. "The enemy feeds us, clothes us, even lets us hear their music. And still, they win every battle." Nakahara looked back at him. "Maybe they win because they don't lose their humanity," he said. The lieutenant nodded slowly, as if trying to understand something that had been hidden from him his whole life. But soon, whispers began spreading through the camp. Rumors of surrender, of bombs, of Japan's coming defeat. And with them came the question none of them were ready to face. What would happen when the war was truly over? The summer of 1945 brought a strange stillness to Camp McCoy. The guards seemed distracted, the officers more tense than usual. Newspapers left lying in the guardhouse carried headlines that made no sense to the Japanese prisoners. Bomb hits Hiroshima, Nagasaki destroyed. The words filtered through the camp, one rumor at a time, carried by interpreters who hesitated before speaking. No one believed it at first. How could a single bomb destroy an entire city? But as the days passed, confirmation came in the form of new orders, new silences, and the heavy look in every American's eyes. The war, they said, was ending. Japan was surrendering. The men gathered outside their barracks, staring at one another in disbelief. Some fell to their knees. Others stared blankly at the ground. For years, they had fought under the idea that Japan could never fall, that the emperor was divine. Now that illusion shattered with a single broadcast. The empire they had died for no longer existed. Lieutenant Takahashi stood motionless by the fence as the news sank in. He didn't speak for a long time. Nakahara approached quietly, unsure of what to say. Finally, the lieutenant murmured, "We lost everything, and yet we live." His voice trembled, not from fear, but from something harder to name. Days later, an American officer assembled the prisoners and announced through the interpreter that they would soon be repatriated. "You will be sent home," he said. "You will return to Japan." The men looked at one another uncertainly. Home. The word no longer meant what it once did. Who were they returning as? Soldiers, traitors, survivors? For many, captivity had stripped them of identity, but also of illusions. In the following weeks, the mood inside the camp changed. The fences no longer felt like barriers, but boundaries they had grown used to. The guards who had once seemed distant now spoke to them like men, not enemies. Small conversations began, broken English mixed with broken Japanese. One guard asked Nakahara about his family. Another showed a photograph of his newborn daughter. When the final orders came to prepare for departure, the camp felt heavier than ever. Each man received a new uniform, clean, pressed, marked with a red circle on the sleeve to identify them as repatriates. They were given food for the journey and allowed one last meal in the mess hall. It was the same food they had grown accustomed to: stew, potatoes, bread, and coffee. Simple, honest, the taste of survival. But this time, every bite carried the weight of memory. After the meal, the guards lined up outside to see them off. There were no salutes, no ceremonies, just quiet respect. One guard, the same cook who had first served Nakahara months before, stepped forward and shook his hand. "Good luck," he said softly. Nakahara, searching for the right words, bowed deeply. It was all he could do. As the trucks pulled away from the camp, the men looked back through the dust. The fences shimmered in the sunlight. What had once been a prison now looked like a strange sanctuary, a place where enemies had become reminders of shared humanity. The voyage home was long. On the ship, the men spoke quietly among themselves. Some laughed, remembering small moments from the camp: the oversized boots, the first cup of coffee, the taste of pie. Others sat in silence, unable to reconcile the two worlds they had lived in, the brutal war and the unexpected kindness of captivity. When they reached Japan, the devastation was beyond words. Cities lay in ruins, families scattered, entire neighborhoods erased by fire. The men stepped onto the docks as strangers in their own land. Some were greeted by relatives who wept with relief. Others faced only silence. To many Japanese citizens, returning prisoners were symbols of disgrace. They had survived where others had died, and that survival carried a shadow. Some hid their POW status, pretending they had worked in distant garrisons. Others, like Nakahara, couldn't hide the truth, and didn't want to. In the years that followed, he kept a single photograph of Camp McCoy, a blurry shot taken by an American photographer showing POWs lined up for dinner. In it, he could see himself at the end of the table, thin and serious, holding